So, how are we going to think about material culture this semester? As Leona Auslander observes, material culture, in its broadest sense, embraces the class of all human-made objects, regardless of manufacture, durability, or value. Often, scholars have limited what they look at, in terms of artifacts, in that they often examine objects that have an aesthetic or other important cultural value. So often, high art or artisanal artifacts like Art Deco furniture and so forth. Or they examine artifacts that are from antiquity recovered through archaeological excavation. In material culture, we more frequently look at objects that are part of larger lifeways or a part of everyday life. Looking at objects in everyday life, we need to look at them ethnographically. Even if they are from the past, we need to make them strange in ethnographic parlance, to look at them as if we are seeing them for the first time. So consider this object. What is it? Okay, I know what you're thinking. It's a can of Coke. Positively ubiquitous, especially in Atlanta, right? You may even have one of these on your desk right now. Often when we consider objects, we focus on what is exceptional or unique. In material culture, however, ubiquity is not necessarily a drawback. In fact, it may be one of the most important aspects of the object. With ubiquity comes familiarity, at least in our own time and culture. And ubiquitous objects in the past were also familiar to those of that era. They may or may not have had an explicit meta-understanding of them. They may have made assumptions about them. When we seek to understand the past, our own culture or another culture, we need to look differently. So we need to make this Coke can strange. How would you understand this object if you didn't know what it was? How would you know what it is? And if someone from the future encountered this object, how would they understand it and contextualize it? The answer to these questions map a trajectory for the concepts and methodologies we will explore in this class. First, we understand this object as an object. We must document and describe it, its form, materials, construction, decoration, style. How would you describe our Coke can? What material is it made of? How is it constructed? Is it made by hand? Is it made by machine? How is it decorated? Are the decorations formulaic? Are they stylized? Are they unique, eccentric? What do we make of the markings on the can? The references to the fluid ounces, right? The calories. What do all of this tell us? Do the colors have any meaning? Why is Coca-Cola written in a script as opposed to printed like the other words on the can? We can look for patterns in all of this and discern meaning. And this helps begin us on the journey of understanding what this object means. What do the symbols mean? What does this object in of itself mean? But then also, how does this object fit into patterns of everyday life? What can it tell us about everyday life? What is inside the can? Can we then reconstruct the ways in which it was consumed? When and how? The contexts? Was it tied to any specific kinds of social relationships? And does the meaning of this object remain fairly constant over time? Does it change? Also, does it have multiple meanings? What is its history, and have its meanings changed? So let's take a little bit of a deep dive into our Coke can. We've talked a little bit about it as an object, just as we're looking at it now. Let's place that in historical context. First of all, origins. Coke has its origins in 1886 when John Pemberton, a pharmacist at Jacobs Pharmacy in downtown Atlanta, first mixed Coca-Cola. It was bottled after 1899. The Coke can itself emerges in the 1950s, but Coke, of course, predates that. So let's take a look at the can itself. One of the first things we do when we come to an object is to look at its form and design. I've mentioned a little bit about that in terms of talking about the can as an object, but we can also put this in historical context. First of all, the Coke can is not the original form that Coca-Cola is bottled and consumed in. Of course, it's originally put into glass bottles. This suggests, and initially it's not even served in bottles, right? It's served in little glasses at the pharmacy. But when it is bottled for mobility and preservation, it is done so in terms of glass bottles. And then we have kind of early can in the 1940s, and then the can as we know it emerges in the 1950s. By 1960, a steel 12-ounce cans are introduced to help make Coca-Cola more portable. And in 1967, Coke adopts the aluminum can. The pull tab's invented in 1959 and adopted by Coke in 1964, and used throughout the early 1960s and 1970s. The push tab, with which we're familiar today, isn't introduced until the 1970s, but is in wide use by the early 1980s and continues till today. So we can look at the changing form of the Coke can as in part related to changes in technology. What kinds of materials are readily available and used for cans? What kinds of technological innovations are created in terms of, say, going from a pull tab to a push tab, and what is the perceived value of that? What are the design decisions that went in to this? These are some of the questions that we can ask when we look at form and design. Now let's move on to context. I mentioned the fact that Coke was originally consumed in little glasses. This tells us a little bit about the kind of early consumption of Coca-Cola and how the context for consumption change and shift over time. And one of the ways in which we can map this is by looking at advertisements. What are the meanings and representations of Coke that portray some of its context for consumption? How is this embodied in advertisements? Early on, Coca-Cola was part of the pharmacy, the culture of the soda fountain, linked first to patent medicines, tonics, and other substances, marketing vitality and health. So the Coke bottle is the receptacle for a substance, right? The substance is what's important here. So the early Coca-Cola advertisements visit our soda fountain. It's considered a brain tonic, right? Something that will help give you energy. And here we have a student late at night studying with his brain tonic by his side. We also have the woman consuming it at a soda fountain. So there is also this kind of sense that this is healthy, this is safe, this is not alcohol, this is an alternative to alcohol, and this is consumed in a context that's wholesome and suitable for women and children as well. Here we have, again, an association of Coca-Cola, not just with health, but also with a sense that it's enervating potential as something that can help with tiredness or exhaustion, and also with headaches. This, of course, is related, we know, to the caffeine that's in Coca-Cola. But the Coca-Cola itself begins to embody this being not just refreshing, but also refreshing in a larger sense of increasing vitality. We also see Coca-Cola marketed to men, as in this last slide, and then in this one, that it's something that the business professional or the industrial worker or the student, can have more energy, but then also it's also suitable for ladies when they're thirsty or weary or even despondent. We also see very early on a conflation of Coca-Cola with health in terms of its association with athletics. This is something that emerges in the marketing of Coca-Cola very early on, as of 1907. And here we see in the image at right, Coca-Cola being marketed and associated with athletics at the 1928 Olympics. And of course, that's something that continues to the present. Here we have images of Coke as a worldwide partner sponsor of the 2012 Olympics. So initially we have this association of Coke with health, with the pharmacy, with a kind of variety of different kinds of tonics and elixirs. But as we move in through the 20th century, we see now that Coke really becomes much more associated with refreshment. And refreshment is not just kind of that pick-me-up you need for work, but increasingly now this is something that's associated with leisure as well. So you're quenching your thirst, but you're also relaxing. You're being refreshed by Coke. And I think, here we have the pause that refreshes at home or on the road. We also see, and I think this is important because Coca-Cola and other soft drinks become an alternative to alcohol, right? In terms of something you can consume in your leisure time. We also see Coke being incorporated into the rituals of social life and the creation of social relationships. And in particular, as this, again, with the soda fountain, is an association with dating, as well as rituals of celebration. And we see also the targeting of specific social groups, teenagers, women, and even later African Americans. But it's interesting, here we see the Coca-Cola is not refreshing, it's not tied to leisure, but here it's a kind of symbol of upward social mobility and assimilation as a sign of good taste. We can also look at advertisements to see some of the relationship of Coca-Cola to the larger cultural landscape and also to emergent cultural contexts. One might be, for instance, the rise of dating, right, in the early 20th century, teenager culture in the 1950s. Also, we see Coca-Cola and other soft drinks, but Coca-Cola is the embodiment of this, having a relationship to freedom, to mobility, tied to the automobile. And so we see Coke begin to mark the landscape. First, we see drink Coca-Cola signs here at Young Brothers Pharmacy in Cartersville, Georgia. And then another one here in Bessemer, Alabama. These would have been, of course, outside of a pharmacy where the soda fountain was located. And here are some other examples of these signs on the side of businesses. We start to see them kind of pop up all over the country. The other thing that becomes really specific is the association of Coca-Cola with the automobile, and particularly the way in which Coke can provide refreshment on the road. And service stations sold Coke from branded refrigerator cases. And also Coca-Cola provided or underwrote a lot of signage for these service stations and then later convenience stores. So here we have Brown Service Station in San Antonio in 1938. Here's a Gulf station attendant in front of one of these branded Coca-Cola refrigerator cases in 1939. So thirst stops here. Again, this is very much, we see Coke being really much part of this kind of larger American culture of being mobile, of being free, and of having the leisure and freedom to do that. We can also think of a cultural landscape more broadly in terms of looking at the association of Coca-Cola with other objects. And here I think we see how Coca-Cola becomes the embodiment of this kind of American consumer culture and early branding, not only in the very consistent script that we see Coca-Cola is always written in, but then also the kinds of objects that then are created to market and dispense Coke, whether it's those branded refrigerator cases at the service station or vending machines. Here's some early vending machines from the 1940s and 50s. This one's from the 1950s. And then, of course, we see these even today all around campus, right? There are Coca-Cola vending machines. We also see branded containers for retail or consumer use. Here are Coca-Cola brand coolers. And a lot of these, some of these are for businesses. Some of them could be taken on a picnic. We also see probably for some sort of diner or eatery, Coca-Cola branded furniture. And then, of course, Coca-Cola becomes very much part of this larger branding of associated materials, toys, and other objects that then are associated with the brand and used to market the brand. These later objects point to the permeation of everyday life with commodities and consumption. If everything is branded or part of marketing, right, then we can see the logo as a kind of free-floating signifier that brands all kinds of things. It kind of seeps into our everyday life. At the same time, Coke, at least in the 1970s, tapped into dissatisfaction with consumer culture with its It's the Real Thing campaign, which began in 1969, maybe by Don Draper, if you've ever seen Mad Men. But here, Coke emphasizes now authenticity at a time of changing social values. The inorganic Coke displayed with organic items, grass, nature, food. An attempt to locate Coke within authenticity amid a period of mass consumption, countercultural change, social and economic decline and dislocation, as in like this kind of rise of post-industrial society and the kind of changing mores of the 60s. So we see this, It's the Real Thing. And then, of course, I'd Like to Buy the World a Coke in 1971. Here, Coke is transcending boundaries, cultures, generations. And, of course, in portraying this multicultural consumer base, masking American cultural imperialism. And this leads us to another context for our Coke can, which is that of global commoditization. Coke began expanding its operations throughout the Americas and then abroad. As early as 1906, Coke was in Cuba, in Panama, and Canada. By 1912, plants were opened in the Philippines, in Europe in 1919 after World War I, and then in the Middle East in Egypt in 1948. Here we see an advertisement that touts the creation of a new bottling plant for Coca-Cola in Johannesburg, South Africa, really marking the truly international age of Coca-Cola. Coke enters India in 1993, Cambodia, China, and is now marketed all over the world. And it's interesting how we see the branding working here with the various languages, but also, again, that scripted logo. If we're thinking about decoration as an aspect of the object, this is where we see the consistent branding. Okay, objects have specific context, as we've seen, and so Coke has this kind of not fixed but evolving context within American life, within global capitalism. But we can also recontextualize objects. We can look at how objects are put into new contexts, or other contexts are also adaptively reused or changed. Not literal recycling, but perhaps related to that. One way we can recontextualize objects is by placing them in a collection. So here we see Coke cans as part of a larger collection of cans. And we'll talk a lot about this toward the end of the semester when we think about how objects are recontextualized within collections and museums. Coke is also, around the world, used to remake new objects. Here's a car that was made out of a Coke can. You often see jewelry made of Coke cans or Coke bottles. And here's even a jacket made from Coke cans. Clothing made from recycled bottles. And we can also see popular cultural appropriation of the Coke can. Here, Lady Gaga using the Coke can as hair curlers in her appearances and in her video. Here we really are seeing how Coke can be appropriated as a symbol because it is a cultural icon. Right, so now we have this kind of iconic status. This is a kind of, the Coke can is signifying way beyond its original context, but carrying with it those prior associations. Another way we can understand the way in which the meanings of an object change and are multiplied is through contestation. And of course, Coke is a highly contested signifier in a variety of contexts. Often we see Coca-Cola as being recontextualized as a part of American cultural imperialism, as a symbol of global capitalism. So, for instance, Killer Coke campaigns in Colombia were tied to critiques of labor relations and the targeting of labor activists. by Coca-Cola and the Colombian government. We also saw campaigns against Coca-Cola with its significant investments in South Africa during the apartheid era. There were calls to boycott Coke because of its extensive operation in apartheid South Africa. Here, Coca-Cola becomes a symbol of U.S. imperialism in a group die-in against the U.S.-led war in Iraq. These are Basque activists in the 1990s, again, protesting Killer Coke in another context. And then in the United States, of course, there's been a backlash against junk food and soda amidst an epidemic of obesity and diabetes. We see concerns about health, backlash against the association of Coke with the Olympics. And here's an example of New York City's campaign against soda. Finally, one other way in which we can understand objects is another kind of recontextualization, which is through commemoration, exhibition, and the exhibition of heritage. Obviously, Coke is a food commodity. It's an artifact and it's an experience. And we see that embodied in the World of Coke Museum, where marketing and the museum experience are fused together. What's interesting here, though, is that Coke is now portrayed not only as a desirable substance. We're creating desire for Coke through the museum, encouraging the consumption of Coke, so it's a marketing adventure, but also we have it as a museum where the various eras of Coca-Cola, advertisements, signs, objects, containers, bottles, cans are presented as actual heritage artifacts. So the items of commercial life are on display now as history. Even as there's this kind of mystique of marketing with the trying all the different kinds of Coke and, of course, the infamous vault. We also see Coke tied to heritage in the preservation of these Coca-Cola so-called ghost signs, often related to historic districting and preservation, neighborhood branding. Here we have an unrestored ghost sign in Fort Collins, Colorado. And you see these all over the country in historic districts. Often they are on the sides of buildings where there were pharmacies, delis, or other kinds of stores. Here's a restored one in Monroe, Washington. And these signs are often restored as part of historic preservation efforts, sometimes even with state grants. I believe that Fort Collins one was restored through a Colorado state grant. But even then, they can also be contested. Here's an example in Bernal Heights in San Francisco, California. There was an epic, not in my backyard battle over the restoration of a vintage Coca-Cola sign. It's located on the site of a house that previously functioned as a store, and a neighbor had registered a complaint with the planning department over the unauthorized billboard. So here again, this kind of complicated history between marketing, advertisement, consumer culture, and history and preservation on the other side. The planning commissioners and supervisors were on board with saving the sign, but they finally settle on calling them vintage signs. But we still have to ask ourselves, is this advertising, or is it a historical artifact, or is it both? Again, the meanings are complicated. So I hope this gives you a little sense of some of the ways in which we're going to look at and contextualize objects over the course of the semester, looking at form, at design, at function, at the role that objects play in everyday life, but then also looking at how objects signify, how they have in themselves a kind of agency, and how we manipulate and understand the various meanings that they can have, as well as how we preserve and interpret and recontextualize those objects as historians.